It was one of the coldest winters of the century, and thousands of men died on the highest peaks of the Dolomite Mountains. On one, Col di Lana, rather than struggle across snowfields under fire, Italian soldiers dug through rock and ice to blow up the summit of what would ever after be known as Blood Mountain. This is Col di Lana, the high peak in the Dolomite mountain range that earned the grim name of Blood Mountain after thousands of men died in frontal attacks and the biggest underground explosion of this First World War front.
On the Austro-Italian Alpine front, the mine war had various episodes. The first and most famous was that of the Col di Lana. Col di Lana was in a position that was unconquerable. The Austrians had fortified it from the first day of the war, and the Italians weren't able to take it.
For military tactical reasons, the mountain was very important for the Italians. They wanted to break through the Dolomites to reach the Isaac and Pusta valleys for strategic reasons, and this was the only mountain standing in their way.
It was treacherous and unforgiving high mountain terrain that took soldiers' lives both above and below ground. Col di Lana was the scene of some of the heaviest fighting on the Italian front, a tragic page in the history of Alpine warfare.
Col di Lana in particular was a very difficult front on the Dolomites because it included both the characteristics of mountain warfare, that of alpinism, but also the great assaults that were characteristic of the Isonzo front and the Eastern front.
They wanted to take the mountain at any price. The Austrians had at that time just put small groups on top, but then the fighting went on and on so long, until finally for the Italians the only option left was the explosion.
When Italy entered the war on the 24th of May 1915, its frontiers stood at the edge of today's Veneto region of Italy. The Mountain War was a series of battles fought between 1915 and 1918 across the then border between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Italy. Italy claimed the cities of Trent and Trieste, believing they could annex them in a lightning attack. The spring of 1915 seemed like an ideal moment for Italy to expand its territories northwards and eastwards. These mountains that rise up around the resort town of Cortina were the scene of the harshest battles when the undermanned Austrian garrison retreated to the more easily defended mountain peaks. Italy had hoped to gain its desired territory in a surprise offensive, but the battle soon became bogged down in a high-altitude war of attrition in harsh mountain conditions.
They fought in summer and winter, mostly in bad weather, when they couldn't be seen and they could storm. And in the winter there were avalanches. There were more dead from avalanches than from battles. Nature was deadly in the mountain war.
Soon after fighting began, the Austrian High Command quickly ordered troops to retreat to fortified positions along the ridges. Col di Lana overlooked 3 key mountain passes, and so it was a crucial outpost for controlling the strategic valley of the Adige River and the road to Innsbruck. It became the high ground that each side absolutely had to have. Andy Hawkins and Julia Richardson are archaeologists of the British Durand Group, specialised in exploring the tunnels of the First World War. They have come from England to explore the vestiges of the largest controlled explosion in Italy from that era, the Col di Lana mine. They start their tour with the same view of the mountain that the Austrian artillery had. They meet up with their local guide, Paolo Tassi.
Ciao. Hello. Buongiorno. Buongiorno.
Col di Lana is located in the northeastern corner of Italy, close to what was the frontier with Austria at the time. Paolo will take them as far as he can by Land Rover. During 1915-1916, Italian troops from 6 regiments and several specialized battalions tried over and over again to storm the mountain, which was defended by both the German Autenkorps and later by Austrian regiments. One of the leaders of the Italian assaults was Giuseppe Garibaldi II, known as Peppino. The Australian-born Garibaldi was an Italian patriot and revolutionary, the grandson of Giuseppe Garibaldi, a central figure in the Italian Wars of Independence. Anita Garibaldi is the great-granddaughter of Giuseppe Garibaldi.
Uncle Peppino felt overwhelmed by his Garibaldi ancestry. It was only natural, because he was his grandson. They were very close.
She remembers many of the war stories told by her Uncle Peppino and her father, who also fought in the battle.
Allora, questo qui in centro è zio Peppino.
This one here in the center is Uncle Peppino. And this last one, here on the end, is my father, who was still a young man. He's just a boy here. And this is Uncle Sante, and Uncle Ricciotti, and Uncle Menotti, and they are all together, you see. They have the black band on their arms, because they were grieving the loss of 2 of their brothers.
Like his grandfather, Garibaldi II was a hardened warrior, having fought alongside the Greeks in 2 different wars, as well as conflicts in South America. He served with the British Army in the Boer War and as a colonel in the Mexican Revolution. If there was an impossible battle to wage, Garibaldi was the man to do it.
As far as Col di Lana is concerned, I think it was a battle that was very important for him, especially given his perspective on life. For my father, it was almost as important, because he was almost killed.
The mountain was defended by German soldiers and elite Austrian Kaiserjäger troops, with the backup of the most modern rapid-firing artillery Germany had available. But Garibaldi and the other Italian units had only a small number of antiquated pieces. The frontal attacks up the ridges that led to the summit were literally suicidal. Between July and October 1915, no less than 15,000 Italian soldiers were killed or wounded. However, when the elite German units were sent to the Balkan front in August 1915, defending the mountain fell to the Landesschützen and Kaiserjäger. One of the young officers was Oberleutnant Anton von Tschurchenthaler from near Bolzano. He was commander of the 6th Company of the 2nd Tyrolean Kaiserjäger.
He was a personality, a strong personality. He was nice and everybody liked him, but he was through and through a gentleman and an officer.
Anton von Tschurchenthaler was to be the protagonist of one of the greatest tragedies of the White War in the high Dolomite mountain range. Summer 1915. Italy had been at war just 3 months, and infantrymen from all over the country flocked to the front. As the Italian army mobilized in patriotic spirit, military logistics proved difficult.
In the summer of 1915, the Italians went into the Great War with a Carcano 1899 rifle, a rifle that was advanced at the time. It had a magazine of 6 shots, and at the time the Austrians had only 5. The Italians had a knapsack for the hand grenades and also for personal use, for rations, and a backpack full of all the equipment they needed, their mess kit, shovels, pickaxe, bayonet, which, with all these things, weighed over 20 kilograms.
Piccone, baionetta, pesava oltre 20 kg.
Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were drafted from all over the country and organized into brigades of 2 regiments each, often with no military training.
Questo è un tipico fante italiano del 1915.
This is a typical Italian infantry soldier from 1915. Dressed in a grey-green uniform, equipped initially with only a soft hat. The helmet was given to the infantry soldiers only after a year of war. This helmet, the Adrian model, was inspired by the helmet of the French firefighters. Only in 1916 were the Italians able to produce their own helmet, which was based on the Adrian model.
The Italian army was mobilized so quickly that much of the war manufacturing was based on quantity, not quality. Italian soldiers were only given 1 pair of socks, so these wool wraps became a critical part of the uniform.
Another disadvantage of the Italian military, and in particular the equipment of the Italian infantry, were their shoes. The material the Italian shoes were made of would disintegrate. In fact, a lot of witnesses from the time described them as seemingly made of cardboard.
Like most armies on the Western Front, the Italian High Command failed to understand how technology had changed the face of war. The machine gun, which proved decisive on the First World War battlefields, was a fairly primitive device when war began in August 1914.
The machine gun had different inventors, but the most famous machine gun was created by Hiram Maxim, an American, who had simply studied a specific mechanism by which, by keeping the trigger pressed down, one could shoot the weapon, taking advantage of the energy of the recoil. Hiram Maxim must have earned a lot of money, as afterwards he was the first to build a machine gun that was truly adapted for practical use. The weapon was distributed in much of the world. The Maxim system was chosen by the Russians, the Swiss, Balkan countries, and of course, Germany.
The machine gun recovered the gas from each shot to recock the firing pin and reload a new round automatically. Early water-cooled designs fired up to 600 rounds a minute. Artillery was the main new devastating element of modern warfare. Dozens of new kinds of rapid-fire cannons and mortars were being developed. These modern weapons killed thousands during early frontal attacks. Andy, Julia and their guide have arrived at the base of the mountain and begin preparing for their long ascent. They follow the route Italian infantry climbed to reach their starting points for the attacks against well-defended Austrian positions. The attacks on the Col di Lana began on the eastern side of the hill, where the Italian line formed a natural salient. 2 steep gullies rose to the summit between well-defended ridges. To the north was the ridge known as Castello Ridge. To the southeast, 2 ridges, the Agai and the Salesei, led up to a cliff nicknamed Napoleon's Hat due to its characteristic shape. Below that was the well-prepared Austrian redoubt known as Infanteriestellung 1. Andy and Julia have come to find the tunnel that led to the mine chambers built to blow up the Austrian trenches on the summit. Today, it is a strenuous climb amid the silent splendor. But a century ago, these same rock faces echoed the dreadful clamor of shelling and gunfire.
You've only got to look at the terrain, haven't you, and see that to try and take, entrenchments that are well defended, well prepared, you're talking maybe 10, 20 times the number of men.
Yeah.
Given the casualty rates you're getting, given the type of artillery you're using around here, because it's not really heavy, the really big stuff. So incredibly difficult.
All through the summer of 1915, attacks on the side of the mountain failed, as Italian infantry tried to storm Col di Lana from the northeast with little artillery support, while under heavy bombardment by the Austrians. The balance of firepower changed in September, when the Alpenkorps troops were sent to the Balkans, and the Italians received some heavy artillery in support. Now the new commander, Peppino Garibaldi, could adopt an alternative plan of attack. The defenders had built strong fortifications that provided covering fire for each other. Garibaldi decided to concentrate a heavy attack against the Austrian trenches on the Castello ridge. The Austrians were caught off guard, and on the 22nd of October, after heavy artillery bombardment, the position fell. Garibaldi now sent his infantry to attack the light defences on the Napoleon's Hat, which fell 4 days later. The Infanteriestellung 1 position was more difficult to defeat. Wave upon wave of Italian infantry attacked from different directions with support from the men on the Napoleon's Hat. It fell on the 29th, but hundreds of men died on both sides in this vital battle. Andy and Julia have reached the base of the Napoleon's Hat, the location of the heavily defended Infanteriestellung 1. The Italians still had to climb a long way to the top. Every time the Italian infantry attacked, it was open to massive enemy artillery fire. But slowly they moved up the mountain, building temporary shelters in the rock. On the 8th of November, they were at the barbed wire defences of the summit and began cutting them. Infantrymen poured into the Austrian trenches, but Italian losses were so heavy that they could hold them for a few hours only. The Austrian counterattack and artillery bombardment pushed them back to a safer place below the crest, where they dug in. The successive attacks continued up the two ridges to the summit, where the Italian infantry dug a trench to protect their supply line from enemy fire. The carnage during the assaults on the summit was horrific, with hundreds of men dying each time. The preferred weapon on both sides was the hand grenade. The Italians had adopted primarily the Mills bomb type of grenade, while the Austrians mostly used the long-handled German type. Both used a timed fuse that gave the infantrymen 4 seconds before it exploded. Small mortars fired from the defending trenches cut down attacking units, which were also exposed to artillery fire. By December 1915, there was no more movement on the hillside. The worst winter of the century was setting in. Anton von Tschurchenthaler was a young commander of a company of Kaiserjäger, local soldiers from South Tyrol recruited to defend their homeland. He had 250 men under his command, including infantry, artillery, and sappers.
The majority of the men were Standschützen. They are the protectors of the homeland. But most of the good regiments were already sent to Russia, and at that time it was only the young under 18 and the oldest ones. So sometimes grandsons and grandfathers were fighting together, while many of the other soldiers were fighting and dying in Galicia.
The Austrian troops occupied this tiny, impregnable spot on the summit. The companies would work in week-long shifts. Their trenches were well built of stone and sandbags with barbed wire entanglements. Their sleeping quarters were in the tiny rock cavern on the side of the mountain, where they would take refuge from the cold and snow. In December 1915, temperatures plummeted.
L'inverno 1915 fu uno dei più nevosi e più freddi dell'intero secolo.
The winter of 1915 was one of the snowiest and coldest of the century. Obviously, the snow was an enemy, even worse than the human adversary in flesh and blood. The avalanches were a daily problem for Austrian and Italian soldiers, and often the avalanches were created like a mine by the opposite side, and explosions were used to set them off and to make things difficult for the enemy.
Per mettere in difficoltà con esplosioni l'avversario.
The harsh winters of World War I killed 60,000 Italians and Austrians all told. The cruelty of nature nearly outweighed the cruelty of war. After dozens of futile frontal attacks, the local Italian commander decided it was now time to rethink the campaign. January 1916. The Italian infantry had dug in under the crest of the Col di Lana, which was held by the Austrian infantry. Although now reduced to a small garrison of 200 men, by occupying the summit, the Austrians could still direct artillery fire onto Italian troops in the surrounding valleys. They had a strong supply line going backwards to Mount Sief, while their attackers still had to bring in equipment and food along the covered trench they had carved in the rock. As Andy, Giulia and Paolo make their way up the Italian supply trench, it becomes clear what a difficult task it must have been for soldiers on both sides. They follow the trenches up the crest of the mountain. This was the vital supply line for the soldiers on the summit that so many men died to protect. Frustrated by their inability to take Col di Lana by storm, the Italians brought one of their best engineers to the front to plan a different kind of attack, this time from underground. Gelasio Caetani was a brilliant metallurgy student from a noble family in Rome who had crossed the ocean to study and train in the US, then work for one of the biggest mines in the nation, Bunker Hill in Idaho. When World War I broke out, Caetani decided to head back to Italy, where he volunteered to fight. He was appointed a lieutenant in the 1st Regiment of Diggers and Miners.
To take the strategic peak, which was an important lookout post for the Austrian artillery, the Italians, in particular this genius Lieutenant Caetani, created this plan for a mine tunnel in a V-shape that would have 2 explosive chambers that would impact the peak directly.
Caetani settled into this tiny mountain hut headquarters near the Col di Lana front lines and began plotting how best to blow up the Austrian positions. During the day, he supervised the digging of the tunnel and the engineering of the mines. At night, he wrote letters to family and friends and tried, with his comrades, to make the best of the cold, grim conditions. The plan was to dig a tunnel under the Austrian positions with 2 explosives chambers. Caetani knew from his work in the Idaho mines that a single mine might not be enough to blow the side of the mountain off, and that an Austrian countermine might destroy one chamber, but probably not both.
This tunnel, 100 meters long and having in some places a 42% slope, was built with 2 large explosive chambers that were filled, one with 3.5 tons of gelignite and the other with 2 tons.
Andy and Giulia come across what is left of a tunnel. It is a side entrance to the massive Col di Lana tunnel complex. Further to the left is what remains of Caetani's original entrance.
This looks like the original tunnel.
So the size of the tunnel,
Yeah.
which is quite small, but then that does fit with driving of a mine chamber, so there's no frills attached to that, just getting to the purpose.
You look at this geology and you can see just how sort of layered it is, which of course makes it relatively easy to use picks to drive through.
Yeah.
Because it's volcanic type rock.
Yeah.
So
And great for working silently, being able to use those with picks rather than with drills.
Yeah, because of course once you start having to hammer in with drills, you've got to try and cover that noise.
The tunnel took 3 months to dig in absolute secrecy. Starting in January of 1916, the Italians began chipping at the rock. It was soft and easily removed.
But you've got all the spoil to get out.
Of course, yeah. And you can't let them see these big piles of spoil because it's particularly against the snow. It's going to stand out.
Yeah.
They're going to immediately know what's going on.
Yeah.
No matter how quiet you're picking.
So to counter that, the Italians would pack it into sandbags, and the sandbags would go down the trench.
The trench we just walked up. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's about that deception, really.
Gli italiani adoperarono 1000 accorgimenti per non destare l'attenzione del nemico.
The Italians had many ways of not exposing themselves to the enemy, such as disposing of the debris and spoils that were coming out of the tunnel, because these spoils outside of the tunnel would have muddied the snow and alerted those on the summit that there was something going on further down the mountain.
L'austriaco sulla vetta, che c'era qualcosa di grosso in lavorazione più a valle.
The Austrian garrison was well placed to defend the summit, with a protected supply line from the next mountain down, Mount Siev. Regularly relieved, morale was high, and the troops were confident that they could hold out for a long time. However, Austrian observers from overlooking positions could see the Italian activity, and soon suspected that a tunnel was being built.
Gli austriaci, nonostante tutto questo,
The Austrians, despite these efforts, became aware of the Italian project, and they immediately started building a tunnel for a countermine that was right over the Italian tunnel, with the goal of destroying the Italian mine.
Scoppio saltare per aria I lavori di mina italiani.
Ist von oben aus schon ein sehr guter Einblick hinunter gewesen, weil ein Berg so hinab.
From above, there was a very good view of below, because that is how the mountain was situated. But there were so few troops that the Italians could get close. But they could not take it, until in the end the explosion became the only option. It was the first time an occupied mountain peak was taken by explosion.
Aber das war die erste Sprengung, also die erste Eroberung eines Berges mittels einer Sprengung.
The desperate search for the Italian mine began, and the Austrian engineers began digging a counter-mine shaft down towards the Caetani tunnel.
The more noise you make, the easier it is to triangulate your position in height and depth. So you would take sort of 2 or 3 readings from different positions up on the mountain, and you'd triangulate down. Right, and then you'd start your countermine heading in that direction.
Yeah.
And the trick is to get the countermine close enough, but not to actually break through. Okay, so then you charge your countermine, and then you'd normally put some sort of listening device, and then blow it when the enemy are in the vicinity of your...
The early tunnelling techniques were rudimentary, so the noise and vibrations of the digging were often detectable using simple devices, such as listening or watching for ripples in pans of water. Later, stethoscopes were used. The British soldiers on the Western Front would later be equipped with the geophone, a double stethoscope which allowed the triangulation of vibrations between 2 amplifying plates.
I think the decision then made to undermine, and mine blown in April.
April, yeah.
Yeah, so what you've got is sort of 3 months, 3.5 months of basically digging up.
Hard work.
Hard work.
The Austrian mine blew on the 7th of April 1916. just a few weeks before the Italian mine.
Gli austriaci in tutta fretta approntarono questa galleria e la fecero scoppiare, ma era troppo
The Austrians very quickly built this tunnel and blew it, but it was too deep and it didn't damage the Italian tunnel. The explosion caused the death of 4 engineers who found themselves inside the tunnel and died of suffocation from the gas of the Austrian explosion. But the structure of the Italian tunnel was not damaged, so the mine of Col di Lama could proceed.
La struttura della galleria era salva. Il progetto di mina del Col di Lana poteva procedere.
In the end, you end up with a failed countermine. Right, so they knew it was happening, it was going to happen. They just didn't know when.
Yeah, and you can just imagine the morale up there, knowing that it's going on, that there's a mine that's coming closer and closer.
From that time onwards, the Austrian soldiers holding the summit of the Col di Lana knew their days were numbered. Troops changed shifts every week, so it was a game of Russian roulette as to who would be on the mountain when the mine did actually blow.
Und sie haben mehr oder weniger gewusst, heute Nacht oder morgen wird es in die Luft sprengen.
They more or less knew that tonight or tomorrow morning they would be blown up. From hearsay, intelligence and prisoners, and word of mouth, they knew it could only be a matter of days. When the shift change happened and one regiment went down and the other came up, they all wished each other long lives because they all knew it might be the last time they ever see each other. And of course, 150 people would later be blown to pieces there.
Bei der Sprengung sind 150 Leute damals in die Luft zerrissen worden.
In the week preceding the mine explosion, the summit of Blood Mountain was held by the 5th Company of the Kaiserjäger Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Valentini. On the 16th, the units rotated, and Lieutenant Churchenthaler's 6th Company took over. It was a stroke of bad luck. The Italian infantry had begun digging a 100-meter tunnel under the summit. They knew the direction of the enemy trenches, but had to constantly check their position to ensure they were going in the right direction. For Caetani and the engineers preparing the mine, any misstep could be disastrous. His journal gives a glimpse of the dangers, pressures, and stress. I am in bed after having climbed to the top of Col di Lana twice. I am tired and sleepy, but I don't know if I can sleep. The body is tired, but my nerves are vibrating like the chords of a violin. It is a battle of deductions, psychology, and technical knowledge. It is the most intense moment of my life. Digging using picks was laborious work, but at times the Italians came across harder rock and had to turn to explosives. In order to cover the sound of the explosive charges, they called in artillery fire to confuse the Austrian defenders. Every move was calculated to deceive.
Per non fare accorgere l'avversario.
So as not to let the enemy know about these explosions, these operations were often coordinated with intense artillery fire to confuse the enemy, who were often using listening devices on the ground.
Rumore, l'avversario che attento, molto spesso, con dei sensori auscultava il terreno.
The explosive used was gelignite, that Lieutenant Caetani had used many times before in the treacherous mines of America. It came in boxes and had to be made safe for transport.
We're using about 5 tons of gelignite. Now, that's a blasting explosive, a quarrying explosives.
Okay.
Okay, and it's primarily a derivative of nitroglycerine, so it contains nitroglycerine. But what they do is they include desensitizers, so waxes and sawdust and things like that. So it usually comes in cartridges when they're blasting. And the reason you desensitize it is because nitroglycerine is a very sensitive explosive.
Lieutenant Churchenthaler was alarmed by the behavior of the Italian infantry. Terrifyingly, they had heard them drilling. But then, eerie silence.
They heard the drilling. They knew that after the drilling would come an explosion. They knew that after there was no more drilling and they saw there were no more materials coming out, they knew, now they're very close to us, and soon they will blow us. And from prisoners and so on, they were able to say with fairly good accuracy when it would be.
Churchenthaler withdrew as many of his troops into the cavern as he could, leaving only a few sentinels outside to watch the enemy activity. He knew a massive attack was being readied and sent a runner down the mountain to the nearby headquarters, pleading for reinforcements. After months of meticulous planning, engineering and digging, the moment had finally come to blow Col di Lana. We can barely breathe. If the fan breaks, we are lost. We can hear the enemy walking overhead, picking. Everything is being done in absolute silence. We are even barefoot, so as not to make any sound. But the work is finished. I will alert the division. It is time for action. Engineer Caetani closed the mine chamber with sandbags, an operation known as tamping, in order to force the explosive energy upwards. At 11:35 p.m. on April the 16th, 1916, Engineer Caetani gave the signal. There was a moment of silence that seemed never ending, and then a deafening detonation as the mine blew apart the mountain.
Lo scoppio fu talmente potente che chi osservava da lontano la cima del Col di Lana.
The explosion was so powerful that you could see it from afar. It seemed for a moment a true volcano. Many of the residents of the Val Badia below, many kilometers away from Col di Lana, said they could feel the explosion shake their homes.
Raccontarono che lo scoppio fu percepito nettamente fin nelle loro abitazioni.
Rocks and debris were sprayed high into the night sky. Earth and boulders rolled down the mountain's flanks into the valleys below. For Caetani and his men, the moment immediately after the blast was terrifying. For a moment, my heart trembled. I thought we were all buried alive. But no, the entry of the tunnel had only been a third closed. And in that very moment, our artillery opened heavy fire on the right side of Col di Lana. Lieutenant Churchenthaler described it like this. The mountain trembled as if it was going to collapse on itself. Everyone tried to get out, in vain. Rock masses and other material had blocked the lower entrances. We were prisoners. The tunnel entrance was quickly reopened, but the tremendous artillery fire made it impossible to exit. Anybody who risked going out would have faced certain death. A part of the mountain collapsed with the soldiers on it. The ground was littered with bodies. At least 150 of Churchenthaler's men had been blown to bits.
They were waiting for death, because no one knew exactly when the explosion would be. They were on top of the peak and under the peak. On the peak there was a tiny group of 250 men, and under there were 50, 60 in a cavern. And they were stuck in a cavern.
The survivors of the small garrison were packed into the cavern with Churchenthaler. They were alive, but they could hardly breathe, and he knew they could not hold out for long.
I think it was an emergency decision. As an officer, he knew there was no other option for his soldiers. He knew that if they stayed shut in that cavern, they would lose all their oxygen.
The Austrians trapped with Churchenthaler under Col di Lana were prepared for their last fight. As Churchenthaler would later recall to his nephew when the two visited the cavern together, it was becoming clear they might not survive much longer.
Sie haben auch keine Luft im Schnaufen mehr gehabt. Sie haben durch diese
They had no more oxygen. The gas went in from the explosion and they tried using clothes and blankets to wave the gas out, but it was useless. They knew they were going to run out of air.
wären sie in die Luft gegangen.
The Italian infantry swarmed into the Austrian trenches, while the dozens of survivors remained barricaded in the small cave. Their commander had to make a snap decision, one that would save the lives of his men.
Es hätte gar keinen Sinn gehabt.
It would have made no sense to stay. They were 80 men in a hole. It was so small. I have no idea how 80 men could have fit in there. For anyone going out, it would have been a suicide, because it would have taken just one Italian to throw a grenade in, and they would have all been blown sky high. He made a decision, as a commander, to take off his weapons and to go tell the Italians, "We are surrendering. We have no more will to fight."
Keine Möglichkeit mehr zu kämpfen.
It was time to surrender. Churchenthaler led his troops out to where the Italian infantry waited and handed over his weapon. They were taken prisoner and led solemnly down from Col di Lana.
Your objective in blowing the mine is not only to destroy the enemy defences, to kill as many as you can, but to demoralise them, so you disrupt their entire ability to defend. And so long as your attack goes in straight away, the enemy don't have the ability to mount a good defence.
Right.
Okay, so you're catching them, in a sense, in a state of shock.
In October 1917, Austrian troops trained in from the Eastern Front broke through the Italian lines at Caporetto, and the entire Dolomite front collapsed. All the gains so painfully won along the mountain front were lost as the Italians were forced to retreat to the Piave Valley. Austrian troops would take the crater of the Col di Lana once again. Today, the younger generations know very little about the Great War. There are only a handful of family members, like Anita Garibaldi or the nephew of Lieutenant Churchenthaler, who can tell the stories as they were told directly to them by the soldiers who survived.
The First World War was a very long time ago. The youth of today doesn't know anything about it anymore, and there are only a few survivors left.
Col di Lana is truly an open-air cemetery. Today, it should be a place that inspires peace, to remember the great suffering that Italians, Austrians, Bohemians, and Bosnians went through for no reason. Because this was a useless war, an extremely hard war.
Today, the massive crater still visible in the side of the mountain is a solemn reminder of the immense sacrifice of so many lives for yet another futile chapter in the great underground war.